On his 73rd birthday, John Miller, a retired construction worker, thought he would enjoy a quiet, peaceful celebration with his family. Little did he know, his son Thomas Jr. had a different idea. With a cold, almost mocking tone, Thomas Jr. publicly humiliated John in front of the entire family, calling him old and useless. It wasn't just the harsh words that stung. No one stepped in to defend him. His daughter Maria, his son Michael, his wife Linda, and even his grandchildren remained silent, as if they all agreed with Thomas Jr.'s cruel statement. The weight of the insult hit John like a wave, but in that moment, something within him snapped. John had spent his life building not just a career, but a family. From humble beginnings, he had worked tirelessly to build the house where his son now lived, a house that John himself had constructed brick by brick. With no architect, no bank loans, only his hands and heart, he had hoped that, after the passing of his beloved wife, Linda, his children would show him respect and care for him as he had for them. Instead, he found himself abandoned and humiliated by the very people he had sacrificed everything for. But John wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. Something awakened in him that night, a fierce resolve to reclaim his dignity. This story of betrayal, personal growth, and justice is just beginning. Stick around, because what happens next will surprise you and show that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, no matter how old you are. After that fateful birthday, where his own son, Thomas Jr., had humiliated him in front of the entire family, John Miller's world began to unravel. But what Thomas Jr. didn't understand was that John wasn't the broken man he appeared to be. Sure, his heart ached, but that didn't mean he would back down. In fact, it was in that moment of betrayal that John realized something powerful. He had been living for everyone else, putting the needs of his family above his own. But now, it was time to live for himself. John sat on the porch that night, looking out over the yard where he had spent countless hours tending to the garden and working on home repairs. This was his sanctuary, the house he had built with his own hands, literally. Brick by brick, nail by nail, this was the place he had put his sweat and blood into. And now, it was the place where his own son had called him useless. As if all his hard work had meant nothing. But John wasn't ready to give up his legacy. Nor was he ready to let Thomas Jr. tear down everything he had worked for. He had worked his whole life in construction, from the days when he was just a laborer to when he became a respected contractor. He had raised his family with love, and after his wife Mary passed away, he had hoped that his children would care for him in his later years. Instead, his son and daughter seemed to treat him like a burden, an inconvenience, and that thought stung even more than the words that were said to him. But as John sat there, the weight of that sting began to turn into something else, a quiet determination. He had been a fighter all his life, and while he had never been one to seek conflict, this time he knew he couldn't let it go. Thomas Jr.'s words were more than just a momentary lapse. They were a reflection of how little respect he had for the man who had given him everything. The very next day, John woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't going to sit back and let his son take what was rightfully his. He wasn't going to let the years of hard work fade away because of one moment of disrespect. John had always been a quiet man, someone who didn't talk much about his finances, his plans, or his successes. But he had made sure that, despite not having a large fortune, he'd built a safety net for himself, something his children didn't know about. For years, John had been saving a portion of his pension, putting away money that he never told anyone about. It wasn't much, but it had grown over time, thanks to some careful investments and his frugal lifestyle. And the house, well, that was the one thing he knew he could control. Thomas Jr. and his family had assumed that the house was in their name simply because they lived there. But what they didn't know was that John was still the sole owner, and he wasn't about to give it up without a fight. That morning, after a quiet breakfast, John put on his old blue shirt, the one Mary had always told him looked good on him, and set out for the notary's office. He had made his decision. It was time to protect his future. He would rewrite his will, making sure that his daughter, Maria, and son Michael knew that he was no longer giving away everything to Thomas Jr. He was leaving his legacy to the one person who had shown him kindness over the years, his granddaughter, Emily. When he arrived at the notary's office, he calmly explained his intentions to the young lawyer. He wanted to ensure that his estate was taken care of and that if anything happened, his legacy would be preserved. The lawyer, surprised at how firm John was, respected his wishes and helped him make the necessary changes. John's assets, including the house, would no longer be up for grabs by a son who thought he was entitled to them. John didn't want to hurt Thomas Jr., but he also knew he couldn't let him get away with this kind of behavior. It wasn't about revenge. It was about respect, and about teaching his son a lesson that would hopefully make him see the error of his ways. After all, respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn. And John knew, deep down, that if he didn't stand up for himself now, he would regret it for the rest of his life. With his will updated and his plans in place, John returned home. He didn't tell anyone what he had done, not yet. Didn't want to start any more fights. But he was ready. He knew that this battle wasn't over, but he also knew that no matter what happened next, he would walk away with his head held high. As the days passed, John Miller knew that the real challenge was only just beginning. He had made his decision. And now, he had to wait. Couldn't shake off the sense of unease that had settled in his chest after rewriting his will. It wasn't just the house or the money that mattered. It was the respect he had fought so hard to earn throughout his life. It was about making sure that the way his children viewed him, the way they treated him, would no longer be something he'd tolerate. John had given his all to his family, but now it was time to put himself first. Thomas Jr. had always been John's firstborn, the son he had worked hard for, the son he had hoped would take over the reins of his business one day. But as the years went on, that hope faded, and a bitter reality set in. Thomas Jr. no longer saw him as a father, but as a burden. The cruelty of his words on John's birthday had cracked open a truth John had been refusing to see for far too long. His son, the one he had raised and sacrificed for, had forgotten who he was. But even more painful than the words themselves was the silence of the rest of the family. His daughter Maria, his son Michael, even his beloved wife Linda, none of them defended him. They all stayed silent. As if John's worth had faded into the background of their busy lives. Sitting at his kitchen table that night, John reflected on the years of work, sweat, and sacrifice. He had built more than just his house. He had built a life, a legacy, and a family. He had poured his heart into every corner of this house, a house that had once been a symbol of his love for his family. But now it felt like a prison. Couldn't help but wonder how everything had gone so wrong. How had his children, his flesh and blood, come to see him as nothing more than an inconvenience? John's thoughts drifted back to the times when Mary was still alive. They had built their lives together, their dreams intertwined, their hard work shared. She had always been his rock, the one who kept him grounded when everything around him felt unstable. But now she was gone, and with her, so much of John's sense of purpose seemed to have vanished. He realized that he had been living for everyone else's children, his family, even his employees. But he had never truly lived for himself, and so, as painful as it was, John made up his mind. It was time to stand up. He wasn't just going to let his son take everything from him. He wasn't going to let Thomas Jr. strip away his dignity or his life's work. He had given so much to his family, but now he was going to give something to himself, respect. And he would not let anyone take that from him. He had learned the hard way that respect wasn't something that could be demanded, but it could certainly be earned in. It was time for him to earn it back. The following morning, John made a call. He contacted his attorney, a steady and reliable man named Richard Evans, who had handled all of John's business dealings over the years. John wanted to make sure everything was in order, legally, his assets, his estate, and, most importantly, the house. He wasn't about to let his son continue living in the house as if it belonged to him, especially when John had built it with his own hands. The house was more than just a property. It was a symbol of John's legacy, a testament to the years of hard work and sacrifice. When John met with Richard, explained everything that had happened with Thomas Jr., he told him about the cruel words, the silence from the rest of the family, and the decision he had made to rewrite his will. Richard listened intently, his brow furrowed in thought. "John, I know this must be difficult," Richard said, "but you're doing the right thing. Your children need to understand that respect is earned, not demanded. And it's clear that your son hasn't earned it." With Richard's help, John made sure that the house, along with his savings and investments, would go to his granddaughter Emily. She had always been the one to show him kindness. Even when the rest of the family seemed to forget who he was, Emily had always respected him, and John knew that she would carry on his legacy with honor. She would take care of the house. She would remember the lessons John had taught her. When John left Richard's office that day, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was in control of his own life again. He wasn't going to let his son take away his dignity, his respect, or his legacy. No, John Miller wasn't done yet. He had one final battle to fight in this time. He was going to fight for himself. In the days that followed, John's decision began to settle in. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about justice. It was about teaching his son, Thomas Jr., a lesson that would hopefully last a lifetime. Respect is something you give, not something you take. And for the first time in years, John Miller could look at himself in the mirror and know that he was still the man who built something from nothing. The man who would never let anyone strip away his pride. As the days passed, John Miller felt an uneasy calm settle over him. He had taken the necessary steps to protect what was his house, his savings, his legacy. But there was still a nagging feeling in the back of his mind. He had always been the silent type, never one to make waves, but this time felt different. His son Thomas Jr. hadn't just insulted him, he had humiliated him in front of everyone. As if all of John's years of hard work and love for his family meant nothing, and the silence from the rest of the family. That was a pain John hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the words that cut deep. It was the feeling of being abandoned, of realizing that the family he had built had slipped away. One moment at a time, John sat at the kitchen table one evening, looking out the window at the setting sun. The house he had built with his own hands, the house that had been a symbol of his labor and love, was now a place of tension. It had once been the heart of his family, filled with the sounds of laughter and warmth. But now it felt cold, almost foreign. Thomas Jr. was still there, living in the house that John had worked so hard to build, as though it was his by right. And that's when it hit John like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about the house. It was about something far deeper. Respect. John had worked his whole life, not just to provide for his family, but to build something that would last. He had raised his children with love, with sacrifice, and with the hope that they would carry on his legacy. But somewhere along the way, his son had lost sight of the values John had tried to instill. And when Thomas Jr. had called him old and useless, it wasn't just a cruel remark. It was a reflection of how much he had come to undervalue John, his father, the man who had given him everything. That night, John made a decision. He wasn't going to sit back any longer. He wasn't going to let his son take the house, take his legacy, and take the respect that was rightfully his. John had spent years quietly saving, building a small nest egg, and putting aside what he could. But he knew that money wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was that his children, especially Thomas Jr., understood that respect was not something you could take for granted. It had to be earned, and in this case, it had to be fought for. The next day, John contacted his lawyer, Richard Evans, a man who had helped him navigate legal matters for years. John explained what had happened, the insult, the silent abandonment, and his decision to rewrite his will. Trott listened quietly, then gave him a reassuring smile. "John, it's time to make sure your legacy is protected, and you have every right to do so," he said. Richard knew how much this meant to John. He understood that this wasn't just about legal documents. It was about a man's dignity, his hard-earned right to be respected by the family he had sacrificed everything for. John knew what he had to do. He arranged to meet with Richard the next day to make the changes official. He would leave everything to Emily, his granddaughter, the only one who had shown him respect in recent years. She had always been kind, thoughtful, and appreciative, and John knew she would care for the house and continue his legacy in the way he had always hoped his own children would. As John sat in the lawyer's office, signing the documents that would secure his future, he couldn't help but reflect on the life he had lived. He had worked hard, he had loved deeply, and he had given everything to his family. But now, it was time for him to take control of his own life again. He wasn't done. He wasn't finished. After the meeting, John returned home with a sense of quiet confidence. He had made the necessary arrangements, but there was still something gnawing at him. He knew that Thomas Jr. wouldn't take this lightly. The battle wasn't over yet, and he would have to face his son again. But this time, John would be ready. He wouldn't let his son walk all over him anymore. The next few days passed in a blur of anticipation. John kept to his routine, waking up early, having coffee, reading the newspaper, walking through the neighborhood. But his thoughts were never far from what had happened. He wondered what Thomas Jr. would do next, how he would react to the changes John had made. Would he fight back? Would he try to take the house by force? John wasn't sure, but he knew one thing. He would stand his ground, no matter what. And then, one afternoon, the call came. It was from Richard. The legal papers had been filed, the will had been updated, and everything was in place. But there was still the matter of confronting Thomas Jr. John's stomach tightened as he heard the words, "It's time to face him, John." And so, the final chapter of this story would begin. But John Miller, the man who had built a life from the ground up, was no longer just fighting for a house. He was fighting for his dignity, his respect, and his future. And he would not back down. The days that followed were filled with a tense quiet that John Miller hadn't experienced in years. He had made the decision to stand up for himself, but now came the hard part. The confrontation with Thomas Jr., there was no denying the pressure building within him. Thomas Jr. had always been the son John was most proud of, the one who, in his mind, would one day take over the family business and carry on his legacy. But now, after the public insult and the realization that his son had no respect for him, John knew this would be the hardest battle of his life. John's routine didn't change. He still woke up early, brewed his coffee, and sat on the porch to watch the sunrise. The neighborhood was quiet, the world outside moving along as if nothing had happened. But inside John, a storm was brewing. It wasn't just about the house or the money yet, it was about the respect he deserved as a father, as a man, and a lifetime of hard work. A part of him hoped that maybe, just maybe, Thomas Jr. would come to his senses. Perhaps he would apologize and recognize the pain he had caused. But John knew better. He had been around long enough to understand people, especially his son. Thomas Jr. had always been driven by ambition and pride, and that pride had led him to believe that he was entitled to everything, especially the house that John had built. John had spent years preparing for the worst. Over the months leading up to his retirement, he had quietly saved a portion of his pension, invested in some stocks, and made sure his finances were in order. He had always been frugal, not because he couldn't afford luxuries, but because he valued security. No one, not even his children, knew the extent of his savings. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to ensure that his legacy wouldn't be stolen. He knew that when the time came, he could fight for what was his. And now that time had arrived. But there was one thing that John had never prepared for: the silence. After the night of the insult, no one had come to his side. Not Thomas Jr., not Maria, not Michael. His other children, who had grown up under his roof, had stayed silent. They hadn't stepped in to defend him, hadn't spoken. Word to challenge Thomas Jr.'s cruelty was a realization that stung more than anything Thomas Jr. had said. His family, his flesh and blood, had left him to fight this battle alone. John knew that the next step wasn't just about standing up to his son. It was about proving to himself that he wasn't going to be silenced, that he wasn't some old man who would simply fade into the background. He had spent too many years being a provider, a father, a husband, and a worker. Now he was going to be something else, a man who took control of his own life. One morning, after a particularly restless night, John received a call from his lawyer, Richard Evans. "John, it's time," Richard said, his voice calm but firm. The legal papers had been filed and everything was set in motion. It was time to inform Thomas Jr. of the changes to the will and to give him the news that John had taken action to protect his future. There was no turning back now. John sat in the living room that afternoon, nervously waiting for Thomas Jr. to arrive. His hands trembled slightly as he sipped his coffee. He had spent years raising his children, teaching them the value of hard work and respect. And now it felt as though everything had unraveled in an instant. He wasn't angry, not yet. But he was determined to show his son that respect wasn't something you could demand by force. It was something you had to earn. And Thomas Jr. had lost that chance. When the doorbell finally rang, John felt a jolt of anticipation run through him. He wasn't sure what to expect. Would Thomas Jr. come in full of arrogance, demanding to know why John had made these changes? Or would he come with his tail between his legs, finally realizing how badly he had misjudged his father? John opened the door to find his son standing there, alone, looking different. There was no wife or children by his side, just Thomas Jr., looking weary and unsure. For the first time in a long while, he didn't look like the confident, self-assured man John had once known. Instead, he seemed almost small. His shoulders slumped as if the weight of what was happening had finally begun to settle on him. "Hi, Dad," Thomas Jr. said, his voice barely a whisper. John stood silently for a moment, taking in the sight of his son, the man who had once been the pride of his life, now standing at the threshold of his home. "Come in," John said, his voice steady but firm. As Thomas Jr. stepped inside, John didn't waste any time. "I'm sure you know why I asked you here," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "I've made some changes to my will. Everything is set in place now. The house, my savings, it's no longer going to you." Thomas Jr.'s face drained of color, opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated. "Dad, I didn't mean what I said. I was angry, but that doesn't excuse it. I've been a fool." John looked at his son, his heart heavy. "You've had plenty of chances, Thomas. But you've crossed a line I can't ignore. Respect isn't something that can be demanded. It's earned, and you didn't earn it." The silence between them hung thick in the air, heavier than any argument they had ever had. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Thomas Jr. looked at his father and said, "I get it now, Dad. I was wrong. I'll accept whatever comes." Next, and in that moment, John Miller knew that this battle, however painful, had been worth it. He had stood up for himself, for his legacy, and for the respect he deserved. He wasn't finished yet. No matter what happened next, he could hold his head high, knowing that he had fought for the one thing that mattered most, his dignity. John Miller felt a sense of calm wash over him. After his confrontation with Thomas Jr., he had made his stand. And despite the bitterness that still lingered, there was a part of him that felt lighter. He had reclaimed his dignity and his rights, even if it meant losing the relationship with his son. For the first time in months, John slept soundly, no longer weighed down by the simmering resentment that had built up over the years. The house, once a symbol of everything he had worked for, no longer felt like a prison. It had become a place of power for John, his refuge, his fortress of solitude where he could reflect on everything that had brought him to this point. The garden outside, the tools in the shed, even the porch swing that creaked when the wind blew, these things now represented his strength. It wasn't just about the house. It was about everything he had built and everything he had fought for. But even though he had taken the necessary steps to protect his legacy, John knew that this wasn't the end. There was still the matter of the legal battles that lay ahead. Thomas Jr. hadn't taken kindly to being cut out of the will, and John was prepared for the fallout. He knew his son's pride, and he could already sense the storm brewing on the horizon. John wasn't sure what was coming, but he had been through enough in life to understand one thing. Life, no matter how old you were, would always throw curveballs. The question was whether or not you were ready to catch them. It wasn't long before John received the call he had been expecting. Thomas Jr. had hired a lawyer. His son was disputing the will, claiming that John wasn't in his right mind when he made the changes. That hurt. It wasn't just the fact that Thomas Jr. was contesting the will. It was the implication that John wasn't competent enough to make his own decisions. For years, he had worked hard to teach his children the value of honesty, respect, and hard work. And now, the very same son who had called him useless was accusing him of being incapable of handling his affairs. John wasn't surprised. Deep down, he had known this day would come. Pride, once wounded, could lead a man to do things he wouldn't otherwise consider. Thomas Jr.'s decision to question his father's mental faculties wasn't about the house or the money. It was about power. It was about trying to regain control over something that had slipped from his grasp. What truly hurt John, however, was the fact that his son was willing to go this far to get what he wanted. It wasn't just about the house. It was about respect, something that John had been denied and was now forced to fight for, even if it meant tearing his family apart. But the more John thought about it, the more he realized something important. This wasn't about the money or the house anymore. It was about making a stand for himself, for his right to live the rest of his years with dignity. Free from manipulation and disrespect, John had lived his life as a man who provided for his family, who worked with his hands, who didn't take shortcuts. And now, as he stood on the edge of his late years, he realized that he didn't need to fight for approval anymore, didn't need to chase the acceptance of someone who had already turned his back on him. John took a deep breath and made another. Called this time to his attorney, Richard Evans. He had known Richard for years, a steady, reliable figure in his life. Richard had helped John navigate many tough decisions in the past, but this one felt different. John knew that this would be a long, drawn-out process, but he wasn't going to back down. "I'm ready," John told Richard when the call was answered. "I've made my peace with this, but I'm not letting him take what's mine." The legal battle began, but John, unlike his son, wasn't blinded by anger or pride. He had made his peace with the situation. As the days went on, the stress of the legal proceedings grew, but John's resolve did not falter. He knew that no matter how much it hurt, he had to stand firm in the face of his son's betrayal. He wasn't just fighting for the house, he was fighting for his dignity, for the respect that had been denied him for far too long. As the legal papers were filed, John spent his days as he always had, taking long walks through the neighborhood, talking to his friends, and keeping to his routine. He had nothing left to prove to anyone. In the end, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about the choice he had made to stand up for himself, regardless of the consequences. And as he sat on his porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, John felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he knew that he could face it head on, with his head held high. He had fought for his dignity, and no matter what happened next, he knew that no one could take that away from him. As the legal battle with Thomas Jr. dragged on, John Miller found himself reflecting on the years that had led him to this point. Every step, every choice he had made in his life seemed to have brought him to this moment, a moment where his own son, the one he had loved and sacrificed for, now stood on the other side of a courtroom. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound ever could. Yet John was resolute, wasn't fighting for the house, the money, or the property anymore. He was fighting for something far more important: his dignity. The courtroom became a battleground, not just for assets, but for respect, for the acknowledgement of a life lived with integrity. Thomas Jr. had hired a lawyer, and now they were doing everything they could to undermine John's decision. The accusations were painful. His son was claiming that John wasn't of sound mind when he made the decision to change his will, that he was too old, too frail to know what he was doing. These were the words that stung the most, the insinuation that John was no longer capable of making his own decisions. It was a cruel attempt to erase his authority, to strip him of his ability to live his life on his own terms. But John wasn't a man who would quietly accept such slights. He had spent years building a life for his family, and he wasn't about to let his son's misguided sense of entitlement take that away. He knew the battle ahead would be long and difficult, but he had already made his decision. He wasn't backing down. This wasn't about revenge. This was about standing firm in the face of betrayal, showing that respect was something that had to be earned, not demanded. The pressure of the court proceedings weighed on him, but John found solace in the small, everyday moments. He continued his routine of early mornings, quiet cups of coffee on the porch, and walks through the neighborhood. These simple rituals gave him strength, reminding him of who he was and what he had built. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He had done the hard work already. His life was a testament to his character, to his unwavering commitment, to providing for his family. Even when it seemed like no one was looking, the legal proceedings moved forward slowly, each day bringing new challenges, new twists. There were days when John questioned whether it was all worth it, whether the pain, the conflict, the heartache were worth the effort. But every time doubt crept in, he would think about the way his son had spoken to him, the way the rest of the family had turned their backs. It was then that John knew he had no choice but to keep going. He wasn't just fighting for his home, he was fighting for the respect he had earned over a lifetime. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of legal maneuvering, the day of the final hearing arrived. John's heart pounded as he walked into the courtroom, accompanied by his lawyer, Richard Evans. The room was filled with strangers' lawyers, witnesses, and reporters who had been following the case. John felt a pang of anxiety, but he quickly pushed it aside. He wasn't there for anyone else. He was there for himself. As the judge began to speak, John listened intently. The evidence was clear. Thomas Jr. had no legal claim to the house. The will, signed and notarized, was valid. But the emotional toll of the proceedings was hard to ignore. Every word from Thomas Jr.'s lawyer felt like an attack, not just on John's legal right to his own property, but on his very identity. They tried to paint him as a frail, forgetful old man, incapable of making decisions for himself. John stood firm. He had to. He wasn't just defending his property. He was defending the man he had always been. He looked at his son, sitting on the opposite side of the room, and felt a mixture of sadness and resolve. This wasn't the son he had raised. This wasn't the child he had poured his heart into. But John knew that sometimes you had to let go. Sometimes you had to draw the line and say, enough. After what felt like hours, the judge finally rendered his decision. The will was upheld, and John's decision to leave everything to his granddaughter Emily was confirmed. It was over. John could hardly believe it. The relief that washed over him was immediate, but it was tinged with a sadness that didn't fade. He had won, but at what cost? As John walked out of the courtroom, he felt the weight of everything he had been through. He wasn't the same man who had walked in that morning. He had stood his ground, fought for his dignity, and won. He couldn't escape the reality that his relationship with Thomas Jr. was shattered. The damage had been done, and while the legal battle had ended, the emotional scars would take longer to heal. John took a deep breath as he stepped out into the sunlight. The world outside was still moving, still going on as it always had.
But
for John Miller, everything had changed. He had taken back what was his. And that, in the end, was all he could do. As the weeks passed following the court ruling, John Miller felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. He had fought for his dignity, for what he had spent a lifetime building. The legal battle with Thomas Jr. was over, and the house's home was secure in his granddaughter Emily's name, just as he had planned. But the victory, while important, felt hollow. He had won the fight for his legacy, yet in the process, he had lost his son. John knew that he would never be able to repair the rift with Thomas Jr. The relationship was beyond repair. And no matter what happened next, his son had made his choices. John had spent years raising him, providing for him, loving him. And all it had taken was a few words, a few cruel words, followed by the silence of the rest of the family to break everything. The house, the money, the legacy, it all seemed less important now. The family that had once meant everything to John had splintered beyond recognition. But John wasn't a man to dwell in despair. He had always believed that life was about moving forward, no matter what. The past was the past, and while the pain of betrayal would never truly fade, he couldn't afford to let it define him. He had spent too many years working for something, building something, to let it be consumed by regret. John took solace in the small, quiet moments that filled his days. The rustling of the leaves in the trees, the sound of the wind chimes. On his porch, the simple pleasure of a cup of coffee on a lazy morning. These were the things that grounded him now, the things that reminded him of the life he had lived and the life he still had to live. Emily visited him often, her bright smile a reminder that there was still love in his life. She had always been the one to show him respect, the one who had never treated him as anything less than her grandfather. When she would sit with him, listening to his stories, asking questions about his past, it reminded John of the days when his own children were young. Emily's presence was a small comfort, and John knew that. Though his relationship with Thomas Jr. was lost, his bond with his granddaughter was just beginning. She was the one who would carry his name, his stories, and his lessons forward, just as he had hoped his own children would. But even as John embraced the future, there was still a lingering sense of injustice that gnawed at him. Thomas Jr. had pushed him to the brink, and now John couldn't help but wonder if his son would ever realize the gravity of what he had done. It was hard to ignore the fact that his son had tried to manipulate him, had tried to claim what wasn't his. And when Thomas Jr. had attempted to use legal loopholes to take the house, it felt like a final betrayal. John had made the decision to stand up for himself, to take back what was rightfully his, and in doing so, he had proven to himself that he was still capable of fighting for his future. But the battle had left scars, not just on his relationship with Thomas Jr., but on his heart. Despite the bitterness of the situation, John tried to focus on the positives in his life, at his health, his friends, and his memories. He spent time with people who appreciated him for who he was, not for what he had. And when he looked out over the yard, the same yard he had worked so hard to cultivate, he saw a reflection of his own strength. The garden was in full bloom, the flowers vibrant and colorful, a reminder of all the work he had put in to make it thrive. It was a small thing, but to John, it meant everything. It was a symbol of his persistence, of his ability to make something beautiful. Even after everything that had been taken from him, one afternoon, as John sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the hills, he thought about the future. He had been through so much in his life, and though the pain of betrayal still lingered, he knew he was strong enough to handle whatever came next. Life had a way of throwing challenges at you, but John had learned long ago that it wasn't about no. What happened to you, it was about how you responded. And now, as an older man, he knew that the only way forward was to embrace the life he had left with open arms. No more regrets, no more second-guessing. It was time to live the rest of his years on his own terms. As he thought about the years ahead, John felt a sense of peace. He might never reconcile with Thomas Jr., but he had his granddaughter Emily, and that was enough. He had built a legacy, not just in the house he had constructed with his own hands, but in the love and lessons he had passed down. And though his son had turned his back on him, John could take comfort in the fact that the future, in the form of Emily, was in good hands. John's fight wasn't just about the past, it was about the future, about what he could still contribute, about the stories he could still tell, the lessons he could still teach. And as the last light of the day flickered out on the horizon, John knew that, despite everything, he was still standing strong. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. The days following the final court hearing were filled with a strange stillness. John Miller had stood his ground, fought for what he believed was right, and emerged victorious. But the victory felt hollow. As he sat in his favorite armchair, the house around him, once a bustling home filled with laughter, warmth, and family, felt eerily quiet. His son Thomas Jr. was no longer there, nor would he ever return. And though the house, his home, was safe in Emily's name, a part of John still longed for the family he had once known. The family he had worked so hard to build for a long time. How to work tirelessly to create something that would last, a family, a legacy, and a home. Yet, in the end, the thing that had seemed most important to him, his bond with his son, had crumbled like dust in the wind. The hurt from Thomas Jr.'s betrayal still lingered, a heavy weight in his chest that he couldn't seem to shake. Despite the court ruling in his favor, it was the emotional toll of what had happened that was hardest to bear. The house was secure, the finances were set. But the relationship with his son had been shattered beyond repair. John had always believed in the strength of family and the bond between parents and children. He had raised Thomas Jr. with love, sacrifice, and a hope that one day his son would carry forward the legacy he had worked so hard to create. But now that hope felt like a distant memory. Thomas Jr. had shown no remorse for his actions, and John could see in his eyes during the court proceedings that his son was driven by a sense of entitlement that overshadowed everything they had once shared. The love John had for his son, for the family he had built, seemed to mean nothing to him anymore. Still, John refused to let bitterness consume him. He knew that hanging on to anger would only hurt him in the end. There was no denying the pain, the sense of betrayal, but John had learned a long time ago that life wasn't about the things you lost, it was about how you moved forward. And for John, that meant focusing on what was left. Emily, his granddaughter, had been his beacon of hope through all of this. She was the one who had shown him respect and love when it seemed like no one else would. Emily wasn't caught up in the drama of the family conflict. She was the one who would carry on John's legacy, not through ownership of the house or assets, but through the values he had instilled in her. When she visited, she would sit with him for hours, asking about his past, listening to his stories about the early days of his career, about the struggles and triumphs that had shaped his life. Emily's presence brought warmth back into the home, and for the first time in a long while, John felt a glimmer of hope for the future. Yet as much as Emily's visits comforted him, John couldn't ignore the emptiness that lingered in the house. The silence left by his estranged son was deafening. John had spent so many years taking care of his family, putting their needs above his own, that he hadn't truly taken the time to care for himself. Now, in the quiet of his later years, he realized that he had to learn to live for himself. John decided it was time to start living the life he had worked so hard to build. It was time to embrace the things that had once brought him joy: his garden, his books, his walks around the neighborhood. He began taking better care of himself, making sure to spend time with people who valued him, people who didn't see him as a burden or an inconvenience. He joined a local senior group that met every week for coffee and conversation. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a way for John to reconnect with the world outside of his family drama, to remind himself that life, though complicated, was still beautiful. And slowly, John began to heal. The process was neither quick nor easy, but he knew that healing was a choice to let go of the past and focus on the present. He started to find peace in the small things: morning coffee on the porch, the quiet rustling of the trees in the backyard, the sound of his dog's paws on the floor. These simple pleasures became his anchor, grounding him in the present and helping him leave behind the bitterness that had taken root in his heart. One day, as John sat on the porch, watching the sunset with Emily by his side, he realized something important. Despite the pain, despite the loss, he had fought for what mattered most. He had fought for his dignity, for his right to be respected, and for the legacy he had built. And while his relationship with Thomas Jr. could never be the same, John knew that his story wasn't over. He still had a part to play, a lesson to teach. As the sun dipped below the horizon, John felt a sense of peace wash over him. His journey wasn't perfect, but it was his. And for the first time in a long time, John Miller was ready to move forward, embracing whatever life had left. To offer in the weeks following the court ruling, John Miller tried to find some semblance of peace in his life. The legal battle had taken its toll. But now that the house was secure in his granddaughter Emily's name, he hoped things might return to some sense of normalcy. Yet, despite the relief that came with the victory, there was still a lingering pain in his heart, a pain that went deeper than any legal battle. It was the pain of betrayal from the one person he had trusted most, his own son. Thomas Jr., John had spent years nurturing a relationship with his children, always putting their needs first, hoping that one day they would appreciate the sacrifices he had made. But in the end, it was his son who had left him broken, with harsh words and a sense of entitlement that cut to the core. It wasn't just the legal battle, the house, or the money that hurt. It was the emotional toll of seeing someone he loved, someone he had given so much to, turn their back on him. Yet, Despite the betrayal, John refused to be defined by it. He had spent too many years building something to let this tear him down. He had always been a man of strength, of hard work, of perseverance. And in his later years, he knew that he couldn't afford to let anger or resentment rob him of the time he had left. Instead, he focused on the people who mattered him alive, who had shown him the respect and love he had longed for from his own children. One quiet afternoon, as John sat on his porch watching the sun set over the horizon, he reflected on his life. He thought about the years he had spent working, building, raising a family. And then he thought about the moment when he had finally decided to stand up for himself. He realized that despite the pain, he had learned an invaluable lesson. Never let anyone take away your dignity. No matter how difficult the situation may be, John didn't need the approval of his son. He didn't need to be validated by anyone. Elsie had lived a life full of meaning and purpose, and that was enough. The lessons he had learned, the values he had instilled in Emily, would live on long after he was gone. His legacy wasn't in the house or the money, it was in the respect he had earned, the love he had given, and the strength he had shown. In the face of betrayal, as Emily joined him on the porch, sitting quietly beside him, John felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. He didn't have all the answers, and he couldn't change the past, but he knew that he was finally at peace with his decisions. His journey wasn't over, but he had come a long way. And for the first time in a while, John Miller felt truly freed out life lesson, no matter how difficult the road. Always stand firm in your values and never allow anyone to strip you of your dignity. The love and respect you give will always be your legacy, even when others fail to see it. Life is too short to dwell on the past, embrace the present. Cherish those who respect you and build a future you can be proud of. If you enjoyed this story and the lessons it shares, please leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring content, and remember, your journey is yours to shape. Stay strong and never let anyone take away your power.